Welcome to Racing Roundtable on America's Horse Racing Network, TVG. I'm Todd Schrupp. By now, you know what Racing Roundtable is about. We take a topic in the world of thoroughbred racing, and then we bring on experts to talk about it, take your questions as well. It could be said that the topic that we are covering this week, drugs in horse racing, applies to everyone. While it may have been a limited scope with some of the topics in previous weeks, this week it affects everyone involved in thoroughbred racing. Whether you play the races, whether you train racehorses, whether you own racehorses, whether you breed racehorses, any involvement you have in thoroughbred racing is affected by medication policies, and we will be talking and having a frank discussion about the impact of the medication in thoroughbred racing on this edition of Racing Roundtable. The panel we have brought in, which will be changing throughout the evening, is quite esteemed. We start with Ron Ellis, who took out his training license back in 1980. Since that time, he has trained 9 Grade 1 winners. He wins about 20% overall in his career. He also trained champion 2002-year-old champion in 2004, Declan's Moon. Sitting next to him is one of the best trainers of all time. He is second on the all-time win list with 6,410. The one and only Jack Van Berg, inducted into Racing's Hall of Fame in 1985. He was also named the nation's outstanding trainer in 1984. And Jack, you look good with makeup on. I can't remember the last time that you had to have makeup on. Can we get a smile?
I was here last time.
Yeah, so a little while in between since you've had makeup. We're also very pleased to have with us here on the main set Dr. Rick Arthur, who knows what it's like to be a veterinarian from private practice to now in his governmental role with the California Horse Racing Board as equine medical director. We had such a great response to people who wanted to participate in our panel this evening that we've expanded our set. This is the main set, but standing off to the side here in the TVG studios, we have a man that many of you are familiar with. That is my colleague Simon Bray. Simon Bray was a former assistant to Hall of Fame trainer Bill Mott and Henry Cecil before striking out on his own and becoming a Grade 1 winner with Astra and StarTac. And sitting next to him is Dr. Don Shields, who practices veterinary medicine on a private practice on the backside, graduated from the UC Davis School of Veterinary Medicine. He's also founder and CEO of Statison Medical. Standing by in Lexington, Kentucky, a man who has observed thoroughbred racing for many times at Keeneland Racecourse right now is Ray Pollock, longtime editor of The Blood Horse. He also had a stint on the West Coast with the Daily Racing Form that he doesn't talk about very often, but he is now the purveyor of Pollock Report. And if you want the latest information on topics like this, PollockReport.com is the place to go. So now you know the panel that is joining us, and you can join the conversation as well. You can pick up the phone and call 877-855-2884, 877-855-2884 for questions or comments during this conversation, or you can email us roundtable@tvg.com. We thought we would start with this. Consider this for a moment. Let's take a look at the top 10 trainers from last year in the world of thoroughbred racing and notice something next to their names. You will notice these are trainers with medication violations since 2001. This is the top 10 earners in our sport from last year when it comes to training. So again, we're not going to get into how severe the infractions were. We're going to get into this conversation about, is it just part of the training profession? But you can see there, 9 of those top 10 trainers from last year, with the exception of Graham Motion, since 2001, have had some type of medication violation. Jack, you have the perspective of having been around for decades. You have the perspective of being the son of Marion Van Berg, one of the most incredible trainers we've ever seen in the sport. Has the sport truly changed when it comes to medication? How do you look at that top 10 list, and what comes to mind?
Well, Todd, I don't know what those fellas on there got medication violations for, but back when I grew up and when I come around, if you had a medication violation, you went down the road. They sent you down the road. There was no getting a lawyer or anything else. They just said, give you so many days, and out you went, out the gate. I just think it's got carried away nowadays with the medication. What they get by with, what they do, they get a lawyer, they get a fine, and they go on. And the people that suffer from it is the people come to the racetrack, the bettors. They don't get nothing back. If they bet on a horse and he comes up with a positive test, he's lost his money. He don't get anything back. And when the people quit coming to the racetrack, you're not going to have racing anymore. I raced horses in New Orleans with Butte and Lasix. I took the same horses to Hot Springs, Arkansas, where they allowed nothing. The horses run just as good or better in Hot Springs than they did in New Orleans.
Ron, are we fooling ourselves into thinking that, well, during the golden age of racing, there were no violators? I mean, Jack's just saying, look, as far as the penalties back then, they were much more severe maybe than they are now. People keep skating. But are we fooling ourselves that it's gotten worse, or is it the same?
Well, I think we're fooling ourselves a little bit that it's gotten worse. I think the testing has gotten way more sophisticated than it has in the past. I think the way the officials handle it is a little bit differently. I remember when I very first started training, but that wouldn't include when Jack was training back then. But the state vet would call you in and say, look, you're a little bit over where you should be. It wasn't flagged as a positive all the time. You'd get that. The state vet would say, you've got a little something showing in the test, shouldn't be there, why don't you just cool it? Whatever. It was handled totally different. I think lawyers being brought in by different people have really changed how things are handled.
I want to go back to something that Jack brought up, and Ray, you can speak to this. That is the perception about medication in the sport and what the violations mean and how it turns people off. What is your view of a longtime observer of this industry? Have medication violations gotten out of control, and what is the perception out there as far as you see it?
Well, I think perception is the key word, Todd. The perception is when a trainer gets a positive test, the word doping comes to mind. And in almost every one of those cases that you showed up there, these are therapeutic medications that were over limits, that were given a little bit too close to a race. It's not doping, but the perception is that it's doping. And I think one of the things the industry could do is to put the guidelines so that you cannot give those therapeutic medications as close to the race as they give them now.
Rick, you have played, Dr. Arthur, an integral part in developing the policies and the testing procedures here in California. What about Ron's point about how the testing procedures have become so sophisticated that maybe innocent violations are now being blown out of proportion?
Well, you're absolutely right, and Ron is correct that way. Back when I started practicing, the state-of-the-art was thin-layer chromatography. You'd be looking at micrograms of drugs. We now look at nanograms, billionth of parts per million of drugs, or billion parts per million, and with picograms, we're down to parts per trillion. So we are much more sophisticated, and what people have to realize, we are testing for more drugs at lower levels than any other professional sport. But accompanying with that is we're using more and more drugs in horses today than they did when we first started practicing. Bute and Lasix were rather exotic drugs back when you started using them, Jack, and today they're run-of-the-mill. It's rather astounding the amount of drugs that are given to these horses after entry time today.
I want to stay on the Lasix for a moment because it's become so commonplace, but there was a time, as you pointed out, when Jack Van Berg started training, it wasn't as commonplace. But think about the impact of the Kentucky Derby. Consider this. Between 2002 and 2011, a 10-year period, 98% of the starters in the Kentucky Derby ran with Lasix. Astonishing, 98%. Does anyone on this panel know the last horse that ran in the Lasix, ran in the Kentucky Derby without Lasix?
Don't get mad.
Trained by?
Ron Ellis.
Yeah, and so why would you walk onto that playing field knowing what you're up against and not run your horse on Lasix?
Well, that horse was a unique horse in that he responded adversely to Lasix. I actually had him on Lasix for a couple races. He started out his career very well without Lasix. When he was going to the Santa Anita Derby, I put him on the Lasix, figuring now we're going to shoot for the moon here. And he ran just a horrible 2 races on the Lasix, but he was so dull in the paddock, I figured it was dulling him way too much. Because as you know, Lasix is a diuretic, which lowers blood pressure. And he was a low-key horse anyway. We took him off him for the Derby trial. We took him off Lasix. He won by 8 lengths, and just the rest of his career, he stayed off of it. And he went on to finish 4th in the Derby. He won the Indiana Derby, 4th in the Travers. So he had a great career not on Lasix. But he was one of the few that I think Lasix adversely affected.
And it should be pointed out the last Kentucky Derby winner to win the race without Lasix, Grindstone, back in 1996. Now joining us on the phone is trainer Owen Hardy, who hopes to have Out of Bounds make it to the Kentucky Derby. But Owen, we couldn't help but notice that Out of Bounds is a horse does not run on Lasix. As Ron kind of suggested, it does seem to be a case-by-case basis. What is the cases in your thought process with Out of Bounds?
Well, that's a very good question. Out of Bounds has never exhibited any signs of actually needing Lasix. He's been scoped after most of his works and certainly after all of his races, and he's always been clean as a whistle. And until such time as he actually bleeds and and proves that he actually needs Lasix, I see no point in putting him on it.
How does it relate to as far as the wishes and the goals of your owners, and how much does that weigh into the decisions you make with medication?
Well, it's certainly an out-of-bounds case in all of the Darley 2-year-olds, now 3-year-olds. It was a very pivotal point. Management said they wanted to try an experiment this year last year with the 2-year-olds and this year 3-year-olds to see how far we could get them without actually using Lasix. And I was more than willing to go along with it. And in out-of-bounds case, he's right there. He still hasn't shown any signs of bleeding, and he's still Lasix-free.
Want to mention another 3-year-old contender this year, and that is Alpha, who will be going in the Withers at Aqueduct this weekend, and he is trained by Kieran McLaughlin. This is what Kieran McLaughlin had to say when it comes to Lasix as it relates to his decisions, and that is, there's so much talk of no Lasix, we decided not to run them on it until they need it. No one told me I had to do this. I decided it. And Owen, I mean, it's a point worth pressing when you're training for people like Darley and powerful stables. I mean, you have to be aware that you are an extension of their reputation.
Absolutely. I think if I came up with a positive test, I think, I would be called before the jury or before my peers, and I would have to answer to it. And, depending on the severity of the positive, I'm sure I would pay the price down the road. Darley and Godolphin not only represents Sheikh Mohammed, but it also represents the country of Dubai, the Emirate of Dubai. And so with that in mind, there's an awful lot of weight on my shoulders every time I run a horse.
Owen, we wish you the best of luck with Out of Bounds the rest of the year, and thank you for weighing on this topic of medication. Jack, I want to go back to you because you are on the Kentucky Derby trail, obviously, with Ali Sheba, having won the Kentucky Derby, having won the Preakness. But at the time, going into New York, at that time, they did not allow Lasix. And some people would say, well, Ali Sheba lost. I know you talk about the ride as well, but what about the effect of not being able to race on Lasix in New York back in 1988?
Well, number one, Ali Sheba never did need Lasix. He had an entrapped epiglottis. And he was fourth here the first time I run him as a 3-year-old in an onwards of 2 race, and I was devastated. And they came back and they said he had a trapped epiglottis. I said, well, we'll give him some Lasix, we'll fix that. And we run him the next time in that San Felipe, and we came back and operated on him. Well, then I had him on Lasix, so we left him on Lasix, and then we took him off of Lasix in New York. And I don't like to knock somebody, but Chris rode him like a bug boy that day. And it was just a terrible ride. He came back the next year with no Lasix and set a new track record in Woodward with no Lasix.
Yeah, Ali Sheba, of course, through the 1987 Triple Crown, would be named Horse of the Year in 1988. In the interest of full disclosure, and I want to get to Dr. Shields on our other set in just a moment, have you guys have medication violations, Jack Van Berg, Ron Ellis, at some point in your career?
Oh, yeah, everybody's going to have something. I mean, I've had 2 of them for salicylic acid in Chicago, and they come to find out that is in a horse's system. So it was nothing. I had one in New Orleans when there was 31 trainers had tall one, and they were all with fillies. It was in heat, and they had the wrong thing on the test. But I had in Oklahoma City, I had the polyethylene glycol on a horse one time that comes in Furacin.
Ron, are we getting to the point where if you have a medication violation, a trainer is wearing a scarlet letter and it's unfair?
Well, I think it depends on what it is for and then how many you have. You're going to get an occasional one. I'm very commendable to Graham Motion. If he hadn't had a positive since 2001, that's amazing to me, because you're going to get a bute overage here and there. You're going to get, something that shows up. You cut it a little bit too close, given by accident, contamination of some sort. There's going to be something that you're going to get. It's just amazing to me, like I say, that Graham didn't get something, but most of the time it can be a minor thing and everybody blows it out of proportion, like it's you're trying to dope a horse, as Ray said.
We haven't heard from Dr. Shields yet, and I want to ask you, Dr. Shields, about the lack of uniformity when it comes to medication policies from state to state. Does that lead to a lot of innocent mistakes by trainers?
Well, it certainly can, and the RMTC is doing what they can to try to get uniformity throughout the country. We also have a problem with changing of the limits, like we're changing bute from 5 to 2 in California relatively soon. Dr. Arthur could speak as to when perhaps that's going to be implemented. And the problem with doing these changes is that we have to be clear as to what that equates to how much bute can be given, by what route, how close to a race. And the same will be true for any other medication. On the other hand, we do have a lot of withdrawal information thanks to the RMTC that's really aided the veterinary practitioners in telling people when they go from state to state what to do, what medications to use when, and when to stop.
There are big discrepancies though. I mean, in New York, I think you're permitted to give bute 48 hours out, 24 hours in California. But it goes back to what Ron was touching on and Ray Pollock as well. It's all perception. I know, Don, you could probably attest to this. I did some research. 320,000 horses were tested in 2010. Of those 320,000, only 47 tested positive for what could be classed as horse doping or performance enhancing. So, you know, as Ron said, a bute overage to the general public, it looks horrendous. But in the scheme of things, it's not really that bad, is it?
That's correct. And the RCI, that's from an RCI publication, and the RCI publication suggests that it's 0.015% that have race doping medications.
And there you can see it there. So 99% of the time, the samples are pretty clean. But I still think it's pretty tough as a trainer, especially when you've got a big stable like that. I was lucky not to have a positive in the 8 years I trained, but I had a small stable. When you've got a big stable like Grand Motion, Todd, it's very hard, as Ron pointed out, to keep your hands on everything. You've got assistants all over the country, and there's so many ways in which contamination can occur. So, I mean, it's hats off to him for being clean since 2001.
Let's stay with that point of large stables, though. Joining us on the phone right now is trainer Scott Lake, based on the East Coast. Scott Lake has won over 5,000 career races, $95 million in earnings, and he led the nation in wins in 2000, 2001, 2003, and 2006. Scott, thank you for being on Racing Roundtable.
Thanks, Todd.
Out here in California, we've talked about it. If you ship, you got to usually ship a long ways. We're almost kind of out an island. But you're centrally located on the East Coast where you're going border to border, shipping horses all over to various racetracks. Give us an example of the lack of uniformity with maybe a particular medication that's commonplace but has different rules from state to state to state.
Well, I use a lot of clenbuterol in horses, you know, thinking it's a good bronchodilator, helps clean the horse up and keep them healthy. And when you're talking different states, you're looking at Pennsylvania, you can go anywhere from like 24 to 48 hours. Maryland, 72 hours. Delaware, 72 hours. New York, 4 days. Jersey, Florida, 5 days. So you got to really keep a tight rein on things, you know, not to make a mistake.
Where do you think, and again, we talked about how when trainers get a violation, they're kind of get a scarlet letter for that. Where do you think the testing is maybe unfair, or we can improve with our approach to how we test racehorses?
Well, I think like testing for like therapeutic medications like clenbuterol, things like that, bute stuff, you know, stuff that isn't exotic. The system of giving days and a trainer a black eye for something like that, I think is wrong. I mean, you know, big fines, maybe if it's over an extremely high amount or something, you know, fine, then there's days involved. But like fines, maybe loss of purse or something, but to send a guy on days and then have, you know, the horses run and still, you know, deceives the public a little bit because it's still kind of his program. It's, you know, the same guy helps still take care of those horses.
Scott, thank you for your comments. I want to go back to Dr. Rick Arthur because, as we said, you're helping developing some of the testing policies here in California. And how do you make these determinations? Do you look at other jurisdictions, take into account what they're doing? Ultimately, what guides you?
Well, California has implemented the penalty guidelines that were developed by the RMTC. They're published. Everybody knows what they are. And I will say that since it's become required that a trainer serve days for a clenbuterol violation, whereas prior to the penalty guidelines they only had a fine, we've decreased the number of mistakes dramatically. The groom doesn't have his own clenbuterol bottle when the trainer's going to get a 30-day suspension. So penalties do work. But I do think that the point is well taken. There is a difference between doping and medication errors, and I will tell you that the number of dopings that I've seen in my 5 years as equine medical director are few and far between. Most of them are medication errors, but it's something that trainers do have to pay attention to. I will say in California, my hero is Paul Jones. He started more horses and has not had even a high butte from a race since in the 5 years I've been here, and he runs close to 1,000 horses a year. So it can be done, but it takes a lot of discipline, and I am sympathetic to trainers. It doesn't look good when you put their name up with a check next to them if they had a high butte because their foreman was gone and the head groom treated the wrong horse. And that happens quite frequently. It's a very common history.
Simon, we were talking about some of these overages, how minute they are. Can you give us any perspective on that?
Yeah, I mean, they can be very, very small indeed. I mean, back to Rick's point, just before I get into that, to touch on the point, the analogy I would use about a trainer getting a back eye perceived by the public, it's like the ball player that goes into GNC and picks up the wrong nutrition bar. He's in the back page of the sports section, and he's classed a doper. So, I think we've got to segregate between doping and performance and therapeutic drugs as well. But yeah, I mean, the overages can be so minute. There's a case that I'd bring up with Todd Pletcher a couple of years ago. It involved Mark Hennig and Dave Donk, in which they got a cocaine positive at 60 nanograms. Legal limits for federal aviation, legal limits for pilots, 100 nanograms. So, I mean, it's crazy, really, some of the limits that are set in place.
The cross-contamination, even from human, whether they're recreational drugs or whether they're scripted drugs, you have to worry about that. The testing is so fine nowadays.
It certainly is. And Todd, as you know, working on the backside, you've got feed men bringing the hay in and the straw, and there's so many ways in which feed can get contaminated.
When we return, we'll talk about steps being made to ban Lasix. As a matter of fact, the Breeders' Cup has gotten out ahead on that. More discussion about medication in horse racing when Racing Roundtable returns right after this. Talking about medication in the world of thoroughbred racing, and we mentioned that it affects all of us. The breeding industry certainly is affected by what happens on the racetrack and how horses perform, and really in the capital of America's breeding industry in Lexington, Kentucky. We join Ray Pollock once again. Ray, has it gotten to the point where there are horses who are accomplished on the racetrack, but when they go off the stud, or they go off to broodmare duty, they're viewed with skepticism through the prism of how they performed on the racetrack with certain medications?
Well, either skepticism or uncertainty. When breeders are investing tens of millions of dollars in stallion prospects and millions of dollars in mares, and when buyers are spending a lot of money on yearlings, they don't know if that stallion was a bleeder, how bad it was, if the Lasix that it received made a difference. There's just a lot of uncertainty and, yes, some skepticism. When European buyers are coming to the sales here in Kentucky now, they are really a lot more skeptical than ever before because they're getting horses they take home. They cannot use Lasix. They can't use other drugs that we permit close to races. And, the numbers are declining in terms of participation by Europeans at some of the sales.
Jack, it's often pointed out they don't think the American thoroughbred is as sturdy anymore. Is this because of how we choose these horses in the breeding program and plus the medications they raced on during their careers?
Well, I don't think that has a lot to do with it. I think that they put so much pressure on 2-year-olds. They give so much money out for 2-year-olds that half of these horses come out of the sales. Number one, they give them steroids so they look good in the sale, so they're big and muscle. They come out 2-year-old in training sale. They give them steroids, they give them a clenbuterol, so they work fast, so they work tremendous. Well, half of them are tore up when they're babies. They don't have a chance to develop it. To me, a horse has to tell you what he's going to do as he comes along and give him his time to develop. And I don't think it's the breed as much as the pressure they put on these 2- and 3-year-olds to get to the races. And it's just they rush them so bad. I watch 2-year-olds on the track every morning. They're babies and they're sore already.
And as we mentioned going to the break, the Breeders' Cup is actually doing something about Lasix as it relates to 2-year-olds. In fact, in 2012, the Breeders' Cup has banned Lasix in all of their 2-year-old races. The Graded Stakes Committee is also looking at revoking the grade of any 2-year-old race in 2012 that allows Lasix. All race day medication will be banned from all Breeders' Cup races starting in 2013. What about this push with the 2-year-olds as it relates to Lasix by the Breeders' Cup?
Well, for me, Todd, I think Lasix is kind of a witch hunt with what they're going on to ban the Lasix. Because if you understand what Lasix is, it's a diuretic that lowers blood pressure. That's all it does. It has nothing to do with pain, anything like that. And I totally agree with Jack. The reason that horses aren't as sturdy anymore is because breeders breed for the yearling sales and 2-year-old sales. They don't breed for the longevity. You know, you look back at stallions at Seattle Slew, Affirm, Spectacular Bid. They didn't have to just be champion 2-year-olds to then get shoveled off to the breeding shed. They had to be champion 3-year-olds and champion 4-year-olds. People bred longevity into horses. They're not doing that now. But when you get to the Lasix issue, I don't understand why we want these horses to be bleeding and not performing to their top. And I just think you're going to not have near enough horses to sustain racing day in and day out at the level that we do right now. Horses are not going to be able to run back as quick.
Dr. Arthur, it seems like people's hearts are in the right places. The closer we can get to just hay, oats, and water, that's where everyone wants to be. But is that realistic with something like Lasix?
Well, it is, because people race around the world without Lasix and do quite successfully, and those horses are every bit as healthy as they are in the U.S. I've been to Hong Kong, I've been to New Zealand, I've been to France, I've been to Ireland, I've been to England, and those horses are very healthy horses. The fact of the matter is that horses can race without Lasix. The one thing that people forget when we discuss this, and there's no question that Lasix reduces the amount of bleeding. It also causes the loss of over 20 pounds of weight, as the South African study showed. It also increases TCO2 by 1.7 millimoles per average. So all of those things are performance enhancing, and there's no question that horses that receive Lasix run faster. In fact, one of the first things the RMTC did away with the requirement to see a horse bleed to put them on Lasix, because a lot of people were getting around that. So if one person is going to use a performance enhancer, everybody has to use a performance enhancer, and really that was the logic behind it. It does, there's some argument with people who say, well, it's not a performance enhancer, it just normalizes them. Well, the fact of the matter is, I think most people that are listening to the show would agree, if you give a horse a drug and they run faster, that's a performance enhancer. But that's an aspect internationally that's recognized.
Ron, I've never seen you get this anxious, so I want you to chime in real quick.
Well, my thing would be is in Hong Kong and in Europe, the horses are only racing on the weekends. They're taking the winters off. They're getting breaks. We're looking for horses to run year round. And that's not what happens in Europe. That's not what happens in Hong Kong. They've got seasonal breaks. So horses that get breaks, sure, they don't need the Lasix. But if we want them to fire up 4 or 5 days a racing week all year round, then the Lasix comes in handy a lot. And the other thing about performance enhancing wise, you know, if we could give Ace Promazine, the horse is a high-strung horse. The blood pressure gets pumping very, you know, we get them so that they're at a peak, ready to explode out of the gate. If we could give them Ace Promazine, that would be better than Lasix. If we could give them some of the other, something to tranquilize them just a little bit, just a touch to lower their blood pressure, that would stop them from bleeding, but we can't do it. Lasix is the most minimal of drugs that we can give to do that.
Jack, I'll get to you in just a moment, but I know Dr. Shields and Simon want to chime in on this as well. And Simon, there is this perception, right or wrong, that Lasix is a gateway or almost in some cases a masking agent for other things that could be used as far as PEDs.
No question about that. When I came from Europe to the United States, Lasix and Butte to me were like verboten. I mean, to go back to your breeding answer, you know, my father and I used to come to the U.S. and buy yearlings, and by the time they got back home after 3 months, to coin a phrase, they looked like California raisins because, you know, the anabolic steroids wore off and they just shriveled down. But back to the Lasix point, as far as a masking agent, Don, you could probably talk to that a little bit more, but from a European perspective, in Germany, horses that bleed, that have EIPH, known cases of it, they are refused to be allowed to be bred in the breeding shed. They're not allowed to go to stud. Horses are not allowed to be bred. I know in Hong Kong, if a horse bleeds through the nose a couple of times, they are forced to go on the sidelines for 3 and 4 months to have rest. But back to the question of being a masking agent. Would you concur with that?
No. That's why we have a 4-hour rule. It's been shown, and most racing chemists will tell you that if you use Lasix in accordance with the rules, 4-hour administration, it will not mask medications, illicit substances anymore. Our testing is way beyond that. So, and there's so many other things to touch on here. We have to remember that Lasix, I've never drawn up a shot of Lasix thinking I'm about to administer a performance-enhancing substance. I'm administering a therapeutic medication. I'm administering a preventative medication. We know that over time, a vast majority of horses are going to bleed when they race. And do you want to lose that one race? Do you want to allow pathology to occur? Is the question to everybody. We know that that bleeding, EIPH, is a result of pathology, and we know it's a cause of further pathology. And the great South African study that was done recently shows that without Lasix, about 53 out of 152 horses bled a grade 2, 3, or 4.
4 being the worst.
4 being the worst. 3 and 4 considered severe bleeding. 18 horses bled severely. With Lasix, no horses bled severely, and the grade 2s were reduced to 12. So we went from 53, grade 2, 3, 4, to 12. That's a 77% decrease in the performance-affecting EIPH. And the last thing was, sorry, I'm drawing a blank on it.
Don't worry.
Yeah, sorry.
Simon, but Jack Van Berg's over here saying, I'm next. So Jack, you're next.
Well, I just say this. Number one, Todd, I've taken Lasix. They did that heart operation on me, and then they put me on Lasix. I hate Lasix now, since I had to take it myself. You get cramps in your legs. I mean, it just dehydrates you. A horse can't tell you no. He got to take what you give him. But if you look at the form on Chile and Argentina and see those horses run 40, 50 times a year, some of them that I've looked at the form, they've run 160 times in their life. They don't use Lasix down there. And I found out that when I didn't use Lasix and didn't use Bute, I could run horses every 7, 10 days, run them all my life that way.
Joining us on the phone is someone who has purchased horses all over the world, the unique perspective of Barry Irwin, founder and CEO of Team Valor International. Mr. Irwin, thank you for joining us on Racing Roundtable.
My pleasure.
While waiting for us, you've heard some of the discussion. I don't know if you saw at the top of the show, we showed the top 10 money-earning trainers from last year, and out of those 10 since 2001, 9 of them had some type of medication violation. The lone exception, a guy who works for you, in Graham Motion. Is that a factor when you choose a trainer for Team Valor to represent you? Do you look at their history? Do you look at their operation that way?
Not really. And I don't think very few of the trainers I've used, when they did have an overage or whatever, it was usually a mistake. I don't think too many trainers are trying to take advantage of using normal drugs. I think it's ridiculous. I have heard a lot of nonsense here, just since I've been listening, if I could address
Absolutely.
A couple of these. Okay. One, I think it was Ron Ellis who said that they don't race year-round in England or France. That's untrue. They race thoroughbreds there every day of the week, year-round. They don't run on grass in England over the winter, but they run on other tracks. They've got 3 or 4 tracks open every day where they race thoroughbreds. Same thing in France, and in France they also race on turf every day. So that's ridiculous. Somebody cited the South African study. That guy should go back and read the study and then ask the people how many horses that were given Lasix fainted, just keeled over and couldn't get up because of dehydration down there. It's very hot in South Africa, and a lot of horses in that study, I know guys that were there that worked on that just absolutely keeled over. They don't even mention that. I think that everything I've heard out of Jack Van Berg's mouth sounded really good. The only thing, I'm pretty sure they're using Lasix in Argentina now. I think they changed the rules on that.
Mr. Irwin, so it's obviously clear you would have no problem with Lasix being banned in American racing?
I'd like to see all drugs banned in American racing for one reason and one reason only, for the public perception of it. Right now, the public thinks that we're juicing our horses, and until we get rid of everything, it's never going to change. You know, some people think it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't think so. Anybody that's raced in other countries outside of the United States realizes that we don't need to race on drugs, especially Lasix. And the people that do say that we do need it are mostly trainers, members of the HVPA, or vets, because they've all got a stake in the outcome. Vets make money giving the shots. The drug companies are pushing the stuff because they're making money. Trainers, a lot of them, I think, are actually convinced that they do need it, but I don't think they do. My own trainer thinks they need it. Graham Motion thinks that we should run on Lasix. I think we should. I think it's bad for the PR of the sport.
But Barry, is that one of the reasons why you go to Germany and South Africa to buy these horses? Because they don't race on medication. Would that be?
That was the other thing. I don't know. Was it Simon the one that said that you can't breed a horse that's bled in Germany?
Yes.
Yeah, not true, Simon. They have two levels over there. One is for horses that haven't bled. You're automatically eligible for everything. However, let's say you have a stallion that bled a few times. That horse can go to stud. He can breed to any mare he wants. And if 60% of his horses achieve a certain rating with the jockey club, that horse is then off that probation list, and he can breed to as many mares as he wants, and they can all run. But one of the reasons that I like horses overseas, yes, they've proven that they're tougher, they've got better bone, and I think you're getting a healthier animal. And I brought horses over here that I wouldn't say they're the highest class, they're good class horses, and I bred them myself, and they're producing top class horses in this country because I think the competition is less. I never wanted to breed horses until about 6 or 7 years ago because I just thought it was too tough. But now all these commercial breeders have ruined the product themselves, so guys that breed privately like myself, everything I breed now can cut it. 20, 30 years ago, I wouldn't have been able to do that. But now I can't.
Mr. Irwin, thank you so much for your honest assessment and also correcting the record on some of the things brought up on the show. And when we come back, I want to address something that he got into because we're hearing it a lot in the medical profession when it comes to people. Are doctors pushing prescriptions that maybe people don't need? Does the same thing happen in the world of thoroughbred racing as Barry Irwin suggested? We'll tackle that when we return on Racing Roundtable. Back to our topic of medication in horse racing here on Racing Roundtable. Previously, Barry Irwin called in and corrected a lot of us on some of the things that have been brought up, but he also leveled some pretty serious charges. The idea that there are veterinarians out there practicing on backsides throughout America that are simply pushing medications upon trainers because it's their benefit to do so from pharmaceutical companies. Dr. Shields, what did you think of that comment?
Exemplary veterinary medicine is where we treat the horse as an individual, where you use appropriate diagnostic equipment to arrive at a diagnosis, determine exactly what's wrong with the animal, and then tailor your therapeutic medications and therapeutic procedures to exactly what that patient needs for his exact condition. So I would not be in favor of people pushing medications just in general terms to make money. I don't think that occurs as often as people think it does, and the AEP's put out white papers suggesting put the horse first, treat based on the signs and symptoms and the history of that patient. I'd also like to just touch on the Lasix study one more time.
Yeah, because just to jump in, that's a respected study that Dr. Rick Arthur has touched on. I know many veterinarians around the world. The South African study conducted back in 2009, I think it was. Barry Irwin kind of poo-pooed it. Your response to that?
Yeah, with all due respect to Mr. Irwin, it's always interesting to hear people's opinions, and we can have different opinions, and it's fine, but it is a highly respected crossover study that proved the efficacy of Lasix. And the last thing I'd like to touch on with the Lasix issue is the epistaxis. In countries around the world that we do not use Lasix in, a lot of the regulatory bodies utilize epistaxis, blood at the nostril, as a way to determine which horse is going to have regulatory action, time off. Well, the problem is that usually less than 1% of all the horses running will show epistaxis. Usually it's the grade 3 or 4, the severe bleeders, and of those bleeders, only 6.5% show epistaxis. So how is that fair to any of the racing interests if 6.5% of them receive regulatory effects where 94% don't? And
Simon,
they bled just as bad.
Todd, I just want to clarify
Sure.
my point with Barry Irwin as well. I said that horses that bled weren't allowed to be bred to. He's exactly right. They can, for the reasons he mentioned. If horses get treated with certain medications, they're refused to go to the breeding shed in Germany. That was the point I was trying to make.
Did Simon just admit he was wrong?
It
Let's mark
happens
this
once
down.
in a while.
Okay. Dr. Arthur, we got about a minute before we have to go to break, but you wanted to comment on this perception about Lasix and how it improves horses.
Well, when I first started practicing, I was working for Farrell Jones, and people out in California knew him as Wild Horse Jones. And he told me when I was just wet behind the ears, he said Lasix was the best top that he'd ever seen in horse racing. And this is a guy that had been ruled off for amphetamines. So anyway, not to pick on Ron, but Australia and Hong Kong both race year-round. And in Hong Kong, the stewards actually can demand horses be scoped, and they demand about 10% of the horses be scoped after every race. And the difference there is if they see blood in the trachea, even on endoscopic examination, that horse can't train for 2 weeks. The question is whether the rest's better than giving him just a bigger shot of Lasix a week later.
Ron, do you feel like you're being picked on?
Can I clarify what I meant by year-round racing? Is that the horses are expected to race year-round. In Europe and in Hong Kong, they have all-weather tracks. That's not the good horses that run on grass that are trying. They give the good horses, they only do them periodically, and they don't run that often as they're expected to here.
But there's another element that trainers have to deal with, and well, we'll come back. There's another element that trainers have to deal with when it comes to medication in their horses, owner pressure, a topic we'll cover when Racing Roundtable returns. Back to Racing Roundtable, our subject, medication in horse racing. If you thought the debate has been getting heated here, well, during the commercial breaks, it gets even better. I wish we had a camera going at that time, and the subject of what they're doing in other countries as it relates to America. The bottom line is this: when it comes to thoroughbred racing in America, we can only speak to the demands that are placed on trainers here, and that is kind of to Ron Ellis's point about the use of Lasix. But what about owners? What role do they play in putting pressure on a trainer, the pressure to win? Joining us on the phone now is a man who's trained at the highest level. That is trainer Joe Orsino, and he is a two-time Breeders' Cup winning trainer. He also won the 2000 Preakness Stakes with Red Bullet. Mr. Orsino, thank you for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So is there such a thing as an owner where you want to pass a race, but if an owner knows that there's a medication that can get a horse through, you get pressure to make that move?
I have never come about that, and I'm sure maybe it does happen, but I have never been pressured into running a horse where I didn't want to run, or treating a horse with something that should never go into a horse. I mean, a trainer should never leave themselves subjected to that. I just think that would be terrible.
What about in a more roundabout way, when you look at your colleagues, some of them training at an incredible 36% win percentage at the meeting, and you're coming through with a very solid 20% that would have been even more respected years ago? What about that type of pressure?
You know, Todd, over the years, and I've been training 35 years, I've seen trainers get hot and go on streaks, and they cool off, and it doesn't last. They stumbled into something. Of course, I firmly believe you don't become a good trainer overnight. It takes years of trial and error, and you know it's just not something that the numbers don't add up when somebody goes on such a tremendous roll. I mean, sometimes a trainer will maybe get some new money in the game and get the chance to claim a lot of horses and a lot of fresh horses or something, and they make a good claim or two, but. You know when somebody's operating on those numbers that it can't be on the up and up.
Mr. Orsino, thank you very much for joining us on Racing Roundtable. Rana, I want to ask you the same set of questions, essentially. Have you ever been pressured to let medication kind of get a horse through to the next race?
Yeah, I don't know if pressured. I've had the suggestion of, this horse is tired, and then you get the suggestion, well, can't you give him something? You know, and it's like, well, but then, as a trainer, you have not only the right, but you need to say no, So, I mean, but when they say that, they're talking about legal medications, you know, vitamins, something. But nothing. I've never been pressured by anybody to do anything illegal.
A lot of people's eyebrows were raised when you lost Rail Trip. You had guided him from his maiden victory to be a multiple graded stakes winner, and all of a sudden he leaves California and goes all the way to New York, and he ends up with trainer Rick Dutrow. What was behind how that horse left your barn?
Well, you know, it was a decision by Mace Siegel, who, you know, I've trained for their family forever. And, you know, Mace was getting up there in years a little bit. And I think, you know, he wasn't thinking the way he had all of the time of his life. And I think he was just looking to shake things up. There wasn't anything sinister in it, and there wasn't anything personal in it. And I think you're just talking about somebody that was... had changed a little bit the last couple years of his life in his thinking, because he was the most loyal guy I've ever trained for up until that point. And there wasn't anything sinister behind it.
Well, there's no denying, though, it brings us to the name Rick Dutrow, and rightly or wrongly, he has become the poster boy for medication in thoroughbred racing. And when it comes to violations, to be quite honest, as you see here, the list is long, and he is in a protracted legal battle now to maintain being a trainer and having a license. And Ray, this is something that we talked about at the top of the show. Ray Pollock joins us once again from Keeneland Racecourse in Lexington, Kentucky. When you have a very publicized trainer like Rick Dutrow, who had a horse like Big Brown, and then most people didn't even know what Windstroll was at the time, and there we were on the Triple Crown stage having to talk about that and its effect on a champion like that. But what about trainers like Rick Dutrow, their legal problems, the positives that we see here? How much does it hurt the sport? Can we even quantify it?
Well, I went back and looked at the 1980s, you know, sort of the pre-Lasix era, and looked at the great trainers like Charlie Whittingham, and I looked at Jack Van Berg's record, and Bobby Frankel in the 80s. Those guys had winning percentages between 13 and 17%. No, the only trainer that was over 20% was Woody Stevens on a consistent basis. Last year, there were 6 trainers over 30% that had more than 275 starts across the country. And lifetime, as Joe Osorino was saying, it's hard to maintain, you know, high percentages. Lifetime, Rick Dutrow and his brother Tony have a 25% winning percentage lifetime. And something, you know, something smells with when people win too much. You hear it all the time in the grandstand. And, you know, we're talking about some of these legal medications, but we've seen how performance-enhancing drugs have corrupted baseball, track and field, cycling, and probably some other sports. And I think we're kidding ourselves if we don't think there are some things going on that are performance-enhancing drugs that can't be tested for, or that we're behind on the test for, that are affecting this business.
Jack, does it get your blood pressure up when you think about what a good trainer your dad Marion was, what a career you've had, and then there's someone who eclipses the win percentages that you guys, even your best year had, some are doubling that win percentage. How do you view the cynical term super trainer in thoroughbred racing?
Well, my father, when he raced and I had the horses, he said if we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 50% of the time on our horses, we had a good year. My dad made money in the horse business every year. Started with 1 horse, owned all of his own horses, trained all of his own horses. And that's what he went on and made money with it. And that's the way he went. But you see these guys winning at 35 and 30 and 35 and 36%. I can't get mine to run like that. I may be too old. I think people think when you're old you can't train, but I can't get mine to run that way. And you know, I think, I'm going to tell you right out, I think clenbuterol is one of the worst things that happened to racing. I think they've killed more horses with clenbuterol. If you check the records, horses having heart attacks with that drug is anything. And if you ever put anything on your tongue of clenbuterol, you'll think your heart's going to jump out of your chest. I can tell you that. So, you know, I love the horse more than anything, and I just...
You've given your life to the horse, and you also mentioned, you mentioned before we came on the show, you wanted to give a standing ovation to Doc Allred and what he did at Los Alamitos, banning clenbuterol back in October, and we've also seen some major changes down there. I do want to touch on something.
I'll tell you this. Sure. I think that Doc Allred, I just commend him, put him on the highest level for what he did. He had man enough to stand up and say, hey, guys, you got bad tests, it's hurting our sport, out the door you go. And I'm talking about people who had 90 horses on his grounds, and you run them off. they're still having races over there.
I think it's very important to point out throughout this conversation, there is no attempt to demonize anyone. This is an open and frank conversation about something that affects us all in thoroughbred racing medication. And to that point, Simon, there is a difference in violations. As the trainers on the set here have mentioned, yeah, they've had medication violations before, but not all violations are the same. And then there is the testing procedures that we talked about and kind of referenced a little bit earlier.
Yeah, I want to just follow up on a point that I mentioned earlier about from a trainer's point of view. I have the perspective of being a former trainer and then, you know, being on this side of the fence, if you will. First of all, I never got any, I trained for a big owner in Alan Paulson for 8 years. I never got any pressure, and I would kind of repeat what Owen Hardy said earlier on the show. The pressure was there when you got hired privately by an operation like that to train for them. You lived in fear of getting a positive, for losing that job and bringing disrepute to their name, because a guy like Alan Paulson, one of the most successful, if not the most successful Breeders' Cup winning owner ever. So I think when you train for a big outfit like that, you're a little more cautious. Some of these positives, I think, again, it goes to perception. I want to bring up that case of Todd Pletcher, Dave Donk, and Mark Hennig from a trainer's point of view. We've kind of touched on people getting positives. Here are 3 guys that back in 1999 got a positive for cocaine in 3 tests down in South Florida. The permitted levels of cocaine and metabolites that were found in tests in Florida that time was 0. I know other racing jurisdictions around the country, if a horse gets a cocaine positive of a metabolite less than 100, they disregard it. They don't do anything about it. And to put it in context, these numbers are from the FAA, Federal Aviation Guidelines, of what airline pilots are allowed to have. Cocaine metabolites on the left-hand side, 300 nanograms per milliliter, I think is the correct number there, and the actual cocaine metabolite down to 150 nanograms per milliliter. Todd Pletcher's case, Dave Donk's case, and Mark Hennig, their horses tested with 60 nanograms per milliliter, a number that wouldn't get a mosquito high on cocaine. So, I mean, this is the problem we have. Yes, we have sophisticated testing, but these guys were drugged through the media for 3.5 years to the point where they went to a hearing in South Florida. They were each allowed 2 minutes to present their case because the court reporter was ushered out. He had another case. And then it went on and on and on. And then the suspension was held in New York, and they were nearly suspended in New York. I mean, for clearly contamination. Don, you touched on it earlier. There's so many routes of contamination. It can come off a dollar bill. It can come off the state person testing, collecting the urine. It can come from the feed man delivering the hay. I mean, at some point, we have to be very careful when we release these results. And clearly, these are 3 trainers that weren't hopping horses. But the next thing you know, it's across the newspapers for 3 years, and we look bad as an industry.
And even if we consider mitigating circumstances, the problem is that it is in the media, and it is public perception. And we do have to worry. We're competing for gambling dollars, we're competing for entertainment dollars, and it's all over the place. We do have to distinguish on these positives between the therapeutic medications, the substances, the performance-enhancing, doping substances that have no place in a racing horse, and then also we have to look for these mitigating circumstances for cross-contamination.
Real quick, I want to mention one story, and I've never mentioned this on air, and I could do it in this forum now, because when I trained my first Grade 1 winner, it was Astra in the Beverly Hills Handicap at Hollywood Park. I had an employee working for me that evening I was contacted by a local police department and said this employee had been arrested for a cocaine positive. They were literally flatlining in the middle of the street. That employee, I had no idea he was addicted to cocaine. He'd worked for me for 3 years. He groomed a couple of horses and ran some things in the barn. And he had contact with that filly leading up to the race for about 2 weeks straight. I lived in fear for the next 21 days, thinking that I was going to get a cocaine positive on a first Grade 1 win. I mean, literally, I had a calendar and marked off the days. I think there's a statute of limitations, maybe Dr. Rick Arthur can say after 21 days.
It's 18.
18 days. Yeah, I literally lived in fear for 18 days, and I had no idea that this could happen.
Yeah.
Ray, I want to go back to you in Lexington. Has the damage already been done? And now with all the outlets, you can go online, you can go to Pollock Report and see when these violations happened. There's so many ways that the word gets out there, and then people are painted probably a little bit more severely sometimes than they should be. If horse racing announced tomorrow, everybody's going hay, oats, and water, would it make a major difference to those who gamble on horse racing?
I think it would make a huge difference. The Horse Players Association of North America, HANA, did a survey of its members, and I think 60% said they were concerned about illegal medication in horses, and I think 38% said they would bet more if they had more confidence that it was a clean game. The NTRA did a survey that had similar results, I think, during the McKinsey study that was presented at the Jockey Club Roundtable last year. They had results showing that illegal medication or doping of horses was a serious concern among people who are not fans, that it's a hindrance for them getting involved. So it's a huge problem from a perception standpoint. Even the positives for therapeutic medications come out the wrong way in the media as doping. Again, I think we need to tighten the use of therapeutics. I heard Scott Lake saying that in Pennsylvania you can give clenbuterol 24 hours out. That's ridiculous. It should be 10 days out. And they shouldn't have it that close to a race. And they've got to, it's not as if people in Europe don't use medication to treat problems, or in Australia or in Hong Kong or Japan. They use medication to treat problems, but they don't use it to treat horses close to a race, and that's the biggest difference.
Let's get to the fans now. We've had more calls than the previous two shows combined. A number of people are waiting online right now, so we're going to ask you if you're calling in and you're waiting. Once we get to you and your question, make it about 10 seconds. We'll let our panel answer, and we'll move on to the next question. We thank you for weighing in on this topic. Like we said, it affects us all, medication and horse racing. I want to start with Craven and Philly. Thank you for calling Racing Roundtable.
Hi, thank you. I wanted to know that if a horse is tested before a race, do they still run after they've been tested, or do they let them run and then test them after the race?
Dr. Arthur?
Yeah, most of the testing in the U.S. is done post-race, similar to how they do in the Olympics. There is some pre-race testing, but it's post-race analysis. In Hong Kong, they actually test before the race and have the preliminary results, and if there is an adverse finding, they allow the trainer to scratch prior to the race. So it can be done, we just don't do it in the U.S., but all the testing is post-race.
Tom from Pittsburgh joining us on Racing Roundtable. What's your question for our panel, Tom?
All this talking about testing horses for drugs and everything. What about testing drivers and trainers and jockeys for it?
Well, there is something on now as far as jockeys. I know when you go to Canada, essentially you're taking the equivalent of breathalyzer. If you're a jockey and you show up in the jocks room, do you think we need to do more with people out there?
I think it's a great idea with jockeys. I mean, and I'm sure all the jockeys would be for it too, because they're riding against other guys. They're riding in close proximity. Their life's in danger, and it's no different than driving a car, if not worse.
Yeah. Edward from Michigan joins us now on Racing Roundtable. Edward, what's your question to our panel about medication in horse racing?
My question to you guys is this. Well, let's talk about the real drug that everyone's using in the harness industry. I have 18 horses that I own, standardbreds, that these guys are pumping Epigen into to increase the red blood cells that kills the white blood cells, and they're giving it to the horses 4 days out, and they won't test the horses for it because it's too expensive. And that's the real problem in our industry. And I'd like to see what the response is to that.
Dr. Shields, can you give us a definition of what the drug that he just brought up?
Epigen is a red cell stimulator. It stimulates your bone marrow to produce red cells. And it does produce the red cells at the consequence of the white cells. They also have a white cell producing agent. It's a genetically engineered product. And I was under the impression we were testing for it. I don't know if all areas do. Perhaps Dr. Arthur could answer that.
Well, that really explains the chaos that we're in, that none of us here can quite know, back to the point of whether you can use it in one state or not the other. But I was under the impression that they started testing for EPO. Is that right, Dr. Arthur?
You can test for EPO, but the caller is correct. It has a very short window of detection, and you have to do out-of-competition testing, and most jurisdictions don't have the wherewithal to do that.
And Dr. Arthur, along the lines of testing facilities, do we need more of a national focus? Look, I mean, budgets are short for racetracks across the country, so obviously we're going to skimp where we can, it seems like, as an industry, state to state. Do we need to think more like regionally, have a testing facility out west, Midwest, and East? What's it like in California right now?
Well, California actually does quite well. We spend about $200 a sample, but which is very good in the U.S., probably as much as any laboratory, and we have a very good A2LA accredited laboratory. Hong Kong, by comparison, spends about $700 a sample. They have 6 PhD research scientists that are doing nothing but developing new tests. So it's a little bit different focus. Many laboratories are under the state general fund, and the fact of the matter is horse racing doesn't compare well with kids on welfare.
And Simon, as Dr. Arthur pointed out, rightly so, actually, comparatively to other sports, the racing industry spends a significant amount of money on testing.
You're exactly right. You saw that graphic there. $30 million a year spent on testing for racehorses. That's compared to the U.S. Anti-Doping Agency, which is testing all amateur athletic sport here. They spent $5.6 million back in 2010. An Olympic out of training or out of competition testing only coming at $2.1 million. So, I mean, I know there are a lot more horses running around in the left-handed circle than there probably are Olympic athletes, but we still spend a considerable amount of money, $30 million a year.
Okay, we are running out of time. This show has gone a lot longer than we had planned for, and maybe we're going to have to do it again sometime on Racing Roundtable. It is a topic where the debate will rage. But before we leave, I want to give each of our panelists who made a great effort to be here to just weigh in 30 seconds and a simple question. If you could change one thing about this topic, one thing either we're doing in the industry or if you could change perception about it, what would that one thing be? Let me start with you, Dr. Arthur.
Well, this is one area I would agree with Barry Irwin, which doesn't happen many times over the 30 years we've been together. I would go with the international no medication policy. I think it would solve many, many problems in a number of different areas.
Hall of Fame trainer Jack Van Berg, you made it clear how you feel about clenbuterol. Any one other thing you would absolutely change?
If I was changing, I'd stop all medication. I'd have 3 labs in the country, one in the East, one in the Midwest, and one in the West. And take a percentage of the mutual handle where you have the most sophisticated testing procedure there is and stop all the BS that's going on. I'll tell you flat out.
Aside from being able to train in Hong Kong, what would be the one thing that you would like to? I keep hearing how but it's better overseas than it is here in America.
Yeah, and you know, I'm considered a conservative trainer, and I'm not for getting rid of all the medications that there are. I'm for Lasix, and I just think, you know, historians, if you want to go back to the 70s and check out Oscar Barrera's racing record when there was hay, oats, and water in New York, and no bute, no Lasix, then come talk to me about how this hay, oats, and water works, and we can have a good discussion. And, you know, Barry Irwin's right. You know, we do have a self-interest as a trainer for Lasix because we have to have our horses out there performing to make money. That's how we make money. If we did the markup that Team Valor did, I probably wouldn't be for Lasix either.
That's a shot across the bow. Simon, what about you? What would you change?
Well, it's the perception. Unfortunately, the perception is that everyone's cheating when everyone isn't cheating. There are problems where, you know, contamination, that's the one thing for me. I'd probably clean up the trainer responsibility rule. How you do that, I have no idea. But there are so many areas where a trainer can get a positive test and he becomes the fall guy. Then he's on the back page of the newsprint, and then it's our industry getting drugged through the mud. What about you, Don?
2 things. I would first hate to give up all the advances in medicine and science over the last 30, 40 years for my family, for myself, and I would hate to do that for my patients. So I'm for therapeutic medications. Great, we can have further withdrawal times, stop further out. But the second thing, please understand that the Australians, Hong Kong, Europe, they have Asian screening limits. They have limits that the horse is considered to be negative, no medication if the level is below a certain limit. So the Asian screening limit is similar to what were therapeutic medication levels. So we have to clarify what's going on internationally in comparison to us.
All right,
Ray Pollock in Lexington, Kentucky. I want to get to him. We got about 30 seconds left, Ray. I'm listening to this conversation, level-headed people in the room, level-headed people on the phone, but there is not agreement. Is there hope for uniformity when it comes to medication for this entire industry?
I hope so, but I'm a skeptic. I don't think there is. The United States should be a worldwide leader for the thoroughbred racing and breeding industry. We're losing ground, and I think one of the big reasons is because of medication.
Ray Pollock, thank you for your time, and in Lexington, Kentucky from Keeneland Racecourse. And thanks to our panel who joined us here on the set in the TVG studios in Los Angeles. What are your thoughts? Let us know at tvg.com. You can always email us throughout the year. It is a topic where the debate will continue. And if there's a debate in thoroughbred racing, you'll find the conversation right here on Racing Roundtable. I'm Todd Schrupp. Until next time, may all your photo finishes be winning ones.